So I felt like talking about Metal Gear Solid 3 Snake Eater. I talked a little bit about my apprehensions going into this game at the end of my video about Metal Gear Solid 2 because I feel like the kind of shock ending of that game and the impact that it had on me made it very difficult for me to jump straight into Metal Gear Solid 3. That coupled with the fact that this is heralded by many people as kind of the best game in the series, and it had essentially a lot of hype to live up to, where Metal Gear Solid 2 has always been an extremely polarizing game from all the discourse I've heard about it, in terms of either people extremely love it or do not like it much because of many factors, and including one of the major ones, which was the ride and bait and switch move that was pulled by the development team. Um, so I took a few days off before I jumped into Metal Gear Solid 3, where in the case of when I finished Metal Gear Solid 1, I pretty much immediately jumped into the second game. And also, I had started playing Metal Gear Solid 3 some time ago. I was emulating it on my laptop at the time, and I wasn't really enjoying much because the keyboard controls were really not the way to go for it, and also because it was the original, well, it was the subsistence version of the game, but mapping out the pressure controls for keyboard and mouse was becoming extremely challenging for me, and so I only played up till I think about right before the ending cutscene of the Virtuous mission, so the cutscene on the bridge. So I had a little bit of knowledge about certain things going into this game. I knew that chronologically it was before the events of basically any other game in the Metal Gear series, and we were going to be playing as Naked Snake or Big Boss and seeing how he earned that title, which is also, I don't think that was a spoiler, because from what I gathered, I think people already knew about this fact in the lead up to the release of the game, and also it's mentioned pretty explicitly in kind of the intro paragraph on the HD collection version of this game, which is what I played from on my Steam Deck. So yeah, I think right off the bat, a few things about this game. First of all, I didn't, at the start, I didn't think that it looked as good as Metal Gear Solid 2. There's a couple of reasons for that. First of all, the jump from Metal Gear Solid 1 to 2 was so massive that I feel like even though the raw technology is the same between these two games, since they both came out on the PS2, I feel like Metal Gear Solid 2 just looked super clean and a much more of a step up, jumping straight into that from the original Metal Gear Solid. And also, I think because of the nature of the environments, because everything is indoors, it's a lot of sharp, like technologically, in terms of when the game is set, there's a lot of like sharp features to the game, if that makes sense, as opposed to Snake Eater, which is set in the forest and a lot of tundra regions, because of which there's a lot of like lushness. And I think, especially at the start of the game has this kind of like hazy look to it, which I think over time I grew to like more and more, because I feel like it adds a lot to the aesthetic of the game, and it adds to that feeling of like being a story from the 60s or like an 80s or 90s um, Hollywood spy thriller that is situated in that specific time period. So at the start, I didn't think the visuals were as striking for me going into this game after Sons of Liberty. But I think over time, I definitely grew more accustomed to that. And whenever we shifted to more indoor regions in the game, whether that be Grozny Grad towards the end or Sokolov's research facility, I think indoors this game does look pretty exceptional. And I think overall, in terms of the character models, in terms of a lot of the animations, I think the improvements are pretty clear. But again, because it's not as drastic a step up from Metal Gear Solid 1 to Metal Gear Solid 2 in this case, I think the game had a lot to do for me in terms of creating that impression of being a step up from Sons of Liberty. And as I mentioned, because that game, especially in its ending, had such a profound impact on me, and in those games where you're thinking about the game a few days or weeks after the game has ended, that was Metal Gear Solid 2's ending for me. So going into this game, I didn't want to let myself down because I knew that how revered this game is in the Metal Gear Solid series, and that's why I took a little bit of a break in the middle before I started to play it. But I think where this game really, really sold me right from the start is again the gameplay sandbox and the controls. So while the game controls pretty similarly to what Metal Gear Solid 2 was, I think a massive game changer is having the third person view camera, or basically having the camera mapped to the right stick on your controller, or yeah, basically your right analog stick, right? I think that is a real game changer in how convenient it is to play these games, and it makes it basically is less dated than the previous two entries in the franchise, where while I have gotten used to the amount of buttons you have to be holding down at all times in order to do certain things, I feel like having that liberty in being able to rotate the camera around Snake while you're playing was a major, major game changer in how it felt to really play this game. And I think that's where the biggest step up is for me in terms of the formula of Metal Gear Solid that this game did for me, in that it really made it an extremely fun game to play. And while I already praised this a lot in Metal Gear Solid 2, where pretty much everything worked for me in that game, I think a lot of the things that were still kind of that still created friction, but like unintentional friction between the player and the game, in terms of not, for instance, the survival mechanics in this game are intentional friction where they want you to be grappling with certain things in order to give you that sense of progression, in order to give you that sense of going through this arduous mission over a few days. I feel like the friction in terms of the controls has definitely improved here, because A, I've gotten used to the controls over time, but B, also I think it is much smoother and it allows you to do a lot more things because of the way that the series has evolved. I think definitely spent a lot more time crawling in this game, because in Metal Gear Solid 2, because of the first person shooting, it became extremely easy to kind of abuse the Mark 22 once I got it, and using that to just put enemies to sleep and move on to the next area. Where in this game, there's basically two things that really motivated me to not rely on that. The first was the introduction of durability on your suppressors. Now, while I played on the normal difficulty, which seemed a little bit too easy to me for this game, but I think it enables me to engage more in replaying the game in the future. But I think even though I ended up finding like a decent amount of suppressors throughout the game, that I could go all out on using my guns with the suppressor without ever having to fall into a situation where I no longer have a suppressor. I think just the fact that that mechanic is introduced and it is emphasized by Major Zero in your codec call, it made me think that okay, this is not how they want me to be playing this game, and I actively switched away from that. So that was the first reason. And the second was that I think CQC, or any sort of melee combat, is so much more satisfying in this game than it was in both Metal Gear Solid 1 or 2, where in one specifically it was extremely hard to sneak up behind people and put them in a chokehold, because first of all, the guards would always be patrolling, and when you were behind guards, you kind of had to be pretty much at a standstill, and then hold the action button or circle in order to put them in a chokehold. And more often, I would say 90% of the time, I ended up tossing them instead of being able to put them in a chokehold. So, and that really, in the first game, that was what motivated me to move more to learning the patterns of these guards and avoiding them at all costs. In 2, like I said, it became extremely easy to rely on the first person mode shooting and just use the tranquilizer gun to kind of put the enemies to sleep and move on. I think in this game, because the CQC is improved so much in the sense that the toss is now a CQC slam, which puts the people to sleep or knocks them out anyways, is extremely satisfying to pull off. And even though it's not difficult to pull off, every time I was in a stealth encounter, and that's how I tried to play these games. I always tried to stealth it, and when I get caught, if I think that it's something that I could have avoided, I often kill myself and just in terms of the game, and I try to reload it and do that section again. Um, so yeah, I think every time I was engaging in stealth, I wanted to engage in CQC and take the enemies out through melee rather than relying on my tranquilizer gun to kind of put them to sleep or using any other lethal methods to take enemies out. So yeah, I think the CQC is a big improvement in this. The slam is one, I think also holding on to enemies and using them as a human shield, which I didn't do too often, but the interrogate mechanic, but also just holding them and choking them out is a lot more satisfying in this game, as I mentioned before. And I feel like because of that, the game really incentivized me to try and do that rather than relying on just my tranquilizer. And so I really, really appreciated that change in this game, and it made me engage in the stealth mechanics much more than I was before. And as I said, I spent a lot more time crawling around this game, which brings me to the mechanic of camouflage. I think the entire idea of stealth camo and having to change your camo with the environment is extremely innovative, and I really, really enjoyed that in this game. At the beginning, I did find myself navigating in menus too much, where with any small change in the environment or moving into a new area, I was always trying to get the best camouflage for the best floor tile or for the best kind of. If I'm up against a tree, I would go and change to tree bark. Then if I jumped and started crawling in leaves, I would go change it to leaf. So that was definitely happening a lot at the start, but after a certain point, I think I reached a comfortable kind of threshold where I knew how long I was going to be in certain places and how often I had to keep changing my camouflage, and that gradually reduced over time when I understood the game's mechanics and how effective certain percentages of camouflage would be against enemies at a specific distance, etc. So I think that mechanic really allowed for a lot of engagement in the stealth mechanics, and I really, really enjoyed using it. The stamina mechanic I thought was not as kind of fleshed. It was definitely fleshed out. I don't think it was something that I was enjoying engaging in as much. It was definitely fun to see a lot of Snake's responses to things that you collected from the animals that you killed and collected from the environment. But I don't think it was something that I was actively engaging in as a survival mechanic, but I do think it adds that additional layer, brevity of friction, intentional friction to the game that really makes you feel like you're going through this mission. And it additionally, I think it does add that element of not being able to instantly heal your health in a battle unless you have a life medicine. I think that also adds an extra layer of challenge, which, as I said, playing on the normal difficulty, this game felt slightly easier to me, but I think that added an extra level of challenge that I did appreciate at many points. And it also helped kind of pace out a lot of the boss battles, where sometimes they may have ended more quickly if I figured out the quirks or the kind of gimmicks that the bosses applied in order to kind of beat them. So that's the mechanics on both stealth and survival. I think in terms of the story, I really, really enjoyed the story of this game, but I'm kind of having a difficult time weighing how I feel about Metal Gear Solid 2 versus how I feel about this game, because I feel like the approaches to story are very, very different in both of these. For me, Metal Gear Solid felt like the quintessential Metal Gear game, in the sense that whenever you hear someone talk about Metal Gear, that game to me encapsulated every single thing that I had heard about Metal Gear. It had extremely good sandbox stealth and action both, and it had a multi-layered story with many many twists and turns, which some people would call convoluted, I'm sure. And it basically had a lot of unexpected Kojima quirks that you always hear about, including the ride and switch up, etc. So versus Metal Gear Solid 3 to me feels like that Metal Gear formula kind of situated in this specific genre of kind of the 60s spy thriller, this kind of James Bond archetype of video game, where the story is much more conventionally paced out, and there's a lot less reliance on codec. There's a lot more cutscenes, and there's a lot more kind of indulgence in the characters that you would find akin to some other games. And I think towards the end, of course, there's a still a lot of twists and turns. There's still a lot of reveals that make you gasp and think that, oh, so that's what happened there, and makes a few things click in hindsight that you did experience throughout the game. But I feel like it definitely is not cranked up to 11 like it was in Metal Gear Solid 2, which is why it's very difficult for me to kind of crystallize whether I like Metal Gear Solid 3 more than I like Metal Gear Solid 2. Because even though on the surface this would feel like the story I enjoy more, even though it's 16 hours, I've heard a lot of people describe it as more of a slow burn as opposed to kind of the fast paced nature and kind of back heavy bombshell drops that happen in Metal Gear Solid 2, and the generally compact nature of the story in Metal Gear Solid 1. I think for some reason I'm just not able to get over the lasting shock impact that the end of Metal Gear Solid 2 had on me. And I think its relevance in contemporary times also just elevates that to a very different level for me, where it was something that I was not expecting fully, even though I'd heard things about it, and it really stayed with me for many many days. And the fact that even while thinking about this game I keep constantly going back to that and want like thinking about how great it was is a testament to the impact that the ending of Metal Gear Solid 2 had on me. But overall, I think my thoughts right now are that Metal Gear Solid 3 is a much better and well-rounded game. It is a lot less reliant on codec, which was one problem I did have with the ending in Metal Gear Solid 2, where one of the biggest reveals or the most eye-opening things in that game that I thought about for a really long time, which was when we find out that Campbell is an AI, and they kind of preach about all the informational trash that enters the world these days, and we have to choose what needs to be passed on, and the Patriots are the best people to do that. All of that happens through just a codec call, which, even though all the content was extremely impactful, the medium of delivery being just the codec call is slightly underwhelming when you think about it in hindsight, even though the shock at that moment kind of overpowers that. But I think because of whether that be budgetary increases or just more autonomy given to the team, I think I want to say pretty much all of Metal Gear Solid 3's major plot points happen through actual motion captured cutscenes rather than them being codec calls where it's just two figureheads talking and you're reading the dialogue. And I did really appreciate that. I think it adds that level of polish and makes it feel like a much more premium product and closer to film than this movie has kind of ever been, and closer to a more contemporary form of storytelling that we see in video games these days. And I definitely did appreciate that. Along with that, I think where Metal Gear Solid 2 was a lot about kind of this meta narrative, it talks a lot about the informational age, etc. I think a lot of the commentary that is made about the nature of warfare and how soldiers are these pawns where everyone is just a relative enemy. Basically, every bit of exposition that is dropped by the boss and then in the tape towards the end is, I think, phenomenal, and it really kind of elicits that thought about what warfare really is and the idea of the world being whole and how these powers used to fight with each other whenever a common evil shows up, but then they also turn on each other depending on the circumstances. I think all of those little bits of commentary that exist as, I think, the through line theme in this entire game are extremely impactful and meaningful. And I think the boss's character as a whole is a like a phenomenal addition to the Metal Gear Solid franchise. I think it fits right in to one of the best characters that we've seen, that I've seen in the series so far. And I think the ending at the end, that she was a real soldier who stayed true to what her mission was the entire time, even though this country and the people who she has served has taken everything from her this entire time. I think that, and Big Boss's realization at the end that this is what has been happening, and when he sheds that one tear, I think all of it is extremely impactful. The Metal Gear Solid theme kicking in from, I think it's from Sons of Liberty, but I think it's just the Metal Gear Solid theme at this point, is all of it comes to this like extremely impactful crescendo at the end, where I think this game delivers on pretty much everything you would expect it to deliver on after Metal Gear Solid 2. And I think it does the almost impossible job of refining this formula even further, of taking the story in a completely different direction where it's a prequel. And I'll talk a little bit about this as well, where I think making a prequel like this, which is so far back in time, is extremely difficult, because either A, you have to introduce a completely new host of characters and you have to situate the ideals of this franchise that have existed in a completely different time. And that's difficult because you no longer have those returning or recurring faces to rely on in order to tell the story, and kind of rely on pre-existing knowledge about these characters that the fans have come to love over the years. And also B, the characters that do return are at a much earlier stage in their life, so it becomes extremely difficult to kind of justify their origins while also staying true to the things that they end up doing later on in their life, which we have seen in Metal Gear Solid 1 and 2. So basically that recontextualization of things where you're now viewing things from the eyes of Big Boss and knowing that he eventually ends up becoming the kind of villain for the original two Metal Gear games, and the genetic clones are basically evolved from this perfect soldier. I think all of that is extremely difficult to tackle in a single game, but I think the team do an exceptional job in making you fall in love with these characters while also keeping in context everything that happens later in the series. I think Ocelot is amazing. He's back at his triple quadruple crossing everyone to get his own means out of it. I think a lot of the characters that are mentioned in the future games are present as younger characters in these games are exceptional. I think the Cobra unit, every single one of those emotions is well justified. I think the sorrow popping up in a lot of the cutscenes is a very good detail. I think it's kind of chilling whenever he shows up because of his appearance and his eventual boss fight that does happen in the game. So yeah, I think I have pretty much just praises for Metal Gear Solid 3, and the only comparisons that I'm making are probably unfair to this game because of the amount of hype that it has behind it as being the best Metal Gear game for a lot of people. And I think on the merits of the game itself, it is absolutely a masterpiece, and it's astonishing to me how this series keeps going from strength to strength over the 3 games that I have currently played. And I think that's an impeccable feat, and knowing that it continued this for 2 more numbered entries and many more spin-offs that are also well regarded, it's a pretty big thing. And I think like hats off to the team and the people and who have worked on on this series over the years. But yeah, overall, I think, and I haven't even talked about the music. The music in this game is absolutely unbelievable. The Metal Gear Solid main theme coming back right at the end over the boss's cutscene gave me absolute chills. And before that, like the alert and caution themes in this game are so good. Like a lot of the times I went into alert and caution and just laid in grass just to listen to the themes because they're so vibey and like they give you that 60s feel, and they kind of almost gave me like this cowboy bebop kind of feel where you know how Metal Gear evolves into this like technologically advanced world and franchise, and even the Shagohod in this case, but while also maintaining those like raw tropes of spy thrillers and James Bond type movies. I think it does an exceptional job in that department as well. And yeah, I think the music was phenomenal, and the voice acting etc. remains great as it always has been in the series. Over the all the over the top kind of dialogue, the way that people say things, even the one time that Metal Gear is like kind of uttered in that cutscene with Granin, I think all of it does an exceptional job of building off of the laurels that this series has laid in the past two entries and even beyond that with Metal Gear 1 and 2, while also evolving the franchise in a new direction, a new time period, a new setting with a new host of characters, with also returning characters that you have to respect for the fans. I think it achieves an almost insurmountable task when you think about all the variables that go into this game. And for that, I think, yes, Metal Gear Solid 3 fully deserves its place at the top of a lot of people's lists of just Metal Gear games, but also video games in general. And I think this was an exceptional experience for me. And as much as I want to dive straight into Metal Gear Solid 5, because currently I do not have access to Metal Gear Solid 4 anywhere till the volume 2 of the Master Collection comes out. But I think I will wait off on that so I can play the games in actual release order, because I usually prefer to do that. I think it gives you a lot of context in terms of, even though Metal Gear Solid 5 technically takes place after Metal Gear Solid 3 and before, and Metal Gear Solid 4 is kind of like the definitive ending to the series. I think I want to play them in chronological order. So I'll probably be jumping into Death Stranding next, as I'd mentioned before, to continue my hype train for DS2. So that should be fun. But yeah, I think that's all for now. Metal Gear Solid 3 Snake Eater is indeed a masterpiece. Peace.